Hello, I'm Kelly, and today we're going to talk about some tips and strategies for managing and preventing picky eating in childhood. And with this presentation, I'll share some strategies for creating a really strong foundation in eating and helping your kids develop a healthy relationship to food. Just to introduce myself, I'm Kelly, a registered dietitian. I have a lot of experience working with children and in pediatric nutrition in hospitals in both the inpatient and outpatient settings. I also see patients in my private practice, Blossoming Nutrition, which you can learn more at blossomingnutrition.com. I'm also a mom of a little one. So this presentation is informed by my clinical experience and my own experience as a mom feeding a toddler. My biggest goal is to make mealtimes feel as low stress as possible for both you, the caregivers, and for your kids. It's such an opportunity to connect with your children and your family. And I am so passionate about making that as easy as possible for you and your little ones. So let's get into it. So, what are we going to talk about today? I'll define what picky eating or selective eating is and what it looks like, as well as diet variety and food groups that you may be wanting to see in your child's diet. And the meat of this presentation will be the strategies for helping to prevent and manage picky eating. And then I'll talk about some ways to layer nutrition and fill the gaps while you're working on diet expansion. Finally, we'll talk about some things you might see or what you might be looking for if you wanted to seek additional care. Just a disclaimer, this is a presentation that was generated with a generalized population in mind and is never a substitute for advice from your individual providers. It cannot take into consideration any one person's medical history or specific circumstances. So just keep that in mind as you're seeing this presentation, and always seek advice of your specific healthcare providers with any individual questions. So, what is picky eating and what are we looking for when it comes to this type of behavior? Well, there's no one accepted definition for picky eating. But in general, what we might see is less willingness to eat a wide variety of foods or less interest in trying new foods, developing strong preferences, strong likes, strong dislikes. And we see this ranging, there's a broad spectrum of more common type of picky eating behaviors that are very age expected for young children to extremely selective, extremely restrictive, where it may be actually impacting their mental, emotional, or physical well-being. Some of the more severe picky eating can be classified or meet criteria for pediatric feeding difficulty or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, also known as ARFID. And I want to stress or underscore that some picky eating is actually very normal and really developmentally appropriate for toddler age children from around 18 to 24 months until like kindergarten age, like 5, 6 years old. It's typical for kids to become a lot more selective, a lot more discerning, especially if they were even really curious or really open with food as infants. It's still common for them to kind of go through this phase. This is a phase where children are developing autonomy, developing preferences, and there's actually a theory that this is a phase that is really appropriate and protective, as far as children are now responsible for putting food into their own mouths. And if you think about it, not all foods are actually safe foods to eat. Some plants are poisonous, some food might be undercooked, and those types of things are not actually appropriate to eat. And at this stage, children are really learning what is okay to eat, how much do I need to eat, what foods are safe, and things like that. So there is actually this really natural stage of development that children are going through where they're making these decisions for themselves and they're looking to you for guidance on what is appropriate and what is safe for eating. But if we don't recognize and address picky eating in this stage, or recognize the difference between some of the less severe and more severe extreme picky eating behaviors, it could be inadvertently reinforced or not addressed at all and kind of snowball into a bigger problem later in their development. So these are some signs of picky eating. You can always pause it to take a look if you want to kind of deep dive into this. I won't go into it in too much detail in this presentation style format. This isn't like a validated tool to use for any purposes. It's just a list of things that I've seen in practice and some of the less extreme versions of these things versus more extreme. And so if you're seeing your child either tick off a lot of things in every category or is ending up in the more extreme version, that might be when I would dig in a little deeper with someone on a one-on-one setting. So these are things that, there is a big range from less extreme to more extreme. It may not be every day, it may not be every meal, but some things that you may be looking for. So you may be asking yourself, what is a well-balanced diet? And is my child eating a well-balanced diet? Is their pickiness compromising their nutrition? What I usually ask myself when I'm talking to a family with children is, are they eating at least one food from every food group, and ideally a couple, if not more, from whole grains, proteins, fruits and veggies, and healthy fats? And this table is pulled from the American Academy of Pediatrics and just kind of roughly gives you an idea of what the size of a serving is and how many per day that we're looking for each age group. And it may surprise you that for ages 1 to 3, which is really kind of this sweet spot where the picky eating is like big, that serving sizes are actually quite small. They're, a quarter to a half of what you might eat as an adult or as an older child. So it's really important to keep that in mind when you're assessing the adequacy of your child's diet. Like if you think about like what 1 ounce of a protein-rich food like meat or fish actually looks like, that's pretty small. And like a half an egg, that meets their 1 serving of meat or protein out of 2 for the day. So just kind of gut checking, like where are they at? And is that picky eating behavior starting to compromise potentially what kind of variety they're having? Or maybe it's just quantity and they are getting a little bit of variety. So we see a little bit of a combination of both of those things. So we want that variety, but how do we actually get there? How do we expand diet and increase the variety in the foods that our children are eating? Increased variety equals typically increased nutrition. And so that is something that we're always thinking about as far as expansion. So here are the 10 tips that we're going to go through that I came up with. So these tips are tools that you can use whether or not you're seeing picky eating behaviors, quite frankly. The first 3 are really foundational, or 4 really foundational to just generally creating a healthy relationship to food and you as the parent setting what your role is and setting boundaries and things like that. So some really foundational things here, as well as some ways and strategies to help expand the diet and get more interest in a variety of foods. And really at the root of all these strategies that I have are some really key things that kids crave. Independence, confidence, connection to the trusted adults in their lives and peers, trust and safety at home and with themselves and with you, and fun. That's something that all kids are really, really craving. And when you can add fun to something, you can usually get kids to be really into it. So let's talk through these 10 tips. The first big strategy that I want to talk about, you may have heard called the division of responsibility in feeding, or parents provide and child decides. This was really kind of championed, pioneered, studied by a dietitian named Ellen Satter, and she has some great resources on her own website, which I'll share at the end of this presentation. And I like to think of it as building a sandbox. So what does that mean? Caregivers or parents provide the structure of the mealtime. They set boundaries. You build the walls of the sandbox. And the child gets to decide what happens within those boundaries that you've set. They get to play freely within the sandbox that you've created. So, in this context, the boundaries that the caregivers provide are what food goes on the plate, how much of each food is served, when and where meal times are occurring, and if seconds are offered, which foods and how much of each. And then the child decides what they eat off the plate, if any of the foods, how much they eat of each. They're self feeding, they're guiding what they eat, how they interact or play with the food, and when they're full. Now, it's important to keep in mind when you're building the sandbox, of course, you want to keep your children safe. So sometimes you've set the boundaries, and then there's some adjustments if something they're doing within the sandbox becomes unsafe. They're moving around, they can increase their risk of choking while they're eating, things like that. But ideally, once you've set the boundaries and created the sandbox, you really get to let your children play and do what they want with that during the mealtime. It does give you a lot of freedom to say, like, I've done my job, I've built the sandbox, and if they want to eat, they eat, and if not, they don't. And you're going to find that this strategy actually helps in a lot of other areas of parenting where, like, you set the boundaries and you're gentle yet firm about holding those boundaries. And then you let your child kind of do what they want and be independent and curious within those boundaries. So I think this is a really powerful tool. There's a lot of like troubleshooting that can go into this, and I'll do a specific video just for the building the sandbox. But I did want to introduce it here because I think it's such a big foundational piece of feeding children. And I always talk about it if I see picky eating as a part of the picture. The next sort of core foundational strategy is to keep things as low stress and as low pressure as possible at meal times. Any sort of feeling of stress, even if it's unintentional, can really increase a child's anxiety around food, can increase aversion around food. They may being anxious or stressed at mealtime can activate the part of the nervous system that makes them feel like fight or flight, and they need to be in the part of rest and digest to feel safe enough to explore and be curious about food. So even if you're being really, really gentle, here, try another bite, you'll like it. Don't get up until you've finished another bite, or no dessert until this is done. Those are things that can be stressful for a child. Even watching or giving them too much attention can actually feel like stress or pressure. Children are kind of wired to want to do well by you, their parents and caregivers. So if they feel like there's an opportunity for them to fail, that raises the level of anxiety that they have in any given situation. So if you're giving them any sort of pressure to eat, or if you're watching them eat, then there's an opportunity for them to fail by not liking it or doing something, spitting it out that they think you may not approve of. And so they're constantly aware of that, and that can make the situation feel stressful. But if you've built your sandbox, then you can kind of take your foot right off the gas and say, this meal is just going to be about the social component of interacting with my family members. And, that's going to be the biggest piece of it. You can talk objectively about food by simply describing it or what it does in your body, but without kind of pushing to eat it. Or you can just not talk about the food at all. You're sending really powerful messages about food just by what's on the plate. You got to decide what was on the plate, right? You don't have to necessarily talk about it. What's on your plate is really important. So you can present balance. That's part of, the boundaries that you're setting. You don't have to consistently talk about it because that can feel a little bit stressful or like pressure to children. Meal scheduling. And this is going to look very different for every family depending on what your personal, work and school schedules are like, how many kids are at home and things like that. But generally speaking, the biggest takeaway here is to avoid like a really grazing eating pattern and try to aim for scheduled, discrete meal and snack periods where the child has an opportunity to eat and then take a break from eating. So for toddlers, we're thinking about 4 or 5 meal or snack periods per day, spaced about every 3 or 4 hours throughout between them, so that there's enough time for them to actually digest. Their hunger hormones can decrease, and after the meal and then naturally rise again. And they actually feel appropriately hungry every time they're coming to the table. A grazing eating pattern may inadvertently kind of blunt those hunger and fullness cues, because if you're eating a little bit all day long, you're never really full, but you're never really hungry. And so when you're not really hungry, you're not really driven to try a lot of foods, try new foods that might not be as familiar to you. And you may not be eating enough at any one moment to appropriately grow and develop. So, for adequate digestion and to support biological hunger and fullness, try to space things out and schedule breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, or, breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, that kind of thing, and offer water in between meals and snacks. And when I say meals and snacks, I do mean even snack times are something that can be scheduled and be something where it's like almost a mini meal, where you still want to consider the balance of carbohydrates, protein, and fats. And at any one of these meals, I don't expect a child to eat, 100% every single time, every single day. Kids' hunger and drive to eat changes a lot, especially because their growing changes and they may be going through a growth spurt, or maybe they're growing new teeth and they're not super comfortable eating. So a lot of things are happening in childhood that can impact when they're most hungry and when they're not. But this is sort of setting them up for getting used to a schedule of eating that will carry them for the rest of their lives. Just remind them when the next meal is if they're not hungry at the time that you've scheduled it. And if you start to notice things like, oh, they're really hungry after school, but dinner time's not for a little bit, and then they eat a snack and then they're not going to eat dinner, can you move things around? Can dinner be a little bit earlier? Or maybe that after school snack is more robust and their dinner is a little bit lighter, things like that. So aiming for consistency and never for perfection. Obviously holidays come and things are always going to change. But just keeping in mind that we want to avoid that grazing eating pattern, and aim for something a little bit more structured. Role modeling in family meals is one of my favorite things to talk about when it comes to feeding children and childhood nutrition. There are some amazing benefits to sharing family meal times, even as little as 3 times per week. And there are actually studies to support that. The Family Dinner Project is an organization that has spent a lot of time looking into this and studying the benefits of these meals that we share as a family. And it's really, really amazing. The physical and mental benefits for both kids and adults is astounding, really. It has nothing to do with like the actual nutrition that you're putting into your body. But ultimately, that is something that we do see as a benefit down the line. We see that kids have lower rates of anxiety and depression. They're making healthier food choices. They are the same for adults. They have an easier time managing weight as they get older. So there's just some really, really powerful things happening simply from sharing family meals together. Your kids want to be just like you. They're learning about how to be a human from you. This is the first time they've ever done anything like this, right? They're learning about everything and they're looking to you to be the example. So what you're eating really matters, what's on your plate, how you're interacting with each other at meal times, allowing it to be a time where you can share stories, share, things that are going well or challenges that you're facing, and really talk through them. Being playful and playing games at the table is okay. That's absolutely fine. And to engage with your family in that way is encouraged. So yeah, you can look and find more about the benefits of sharing family dinners together at thefamilydinnerproject.org. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about Nourished. It's a book that was written by a psychologist named Deborah McNamara. She's a child or a family psychologist who noticed in her practice that there was a theme for families that seem to have really strong bonds versus families that maybe had some difficulties with each other. And she noticed that the families with really strong bonds had a consistency in sharing mealtimes together. And she decided to look into it more formally and do some research. And she ended up writing this book, Nourished: Connection, Food, and Caring for Our Kids. If you're interested in learning more about it, that's a really great read. And she found that the family meal times and connection really do strengthen that familial bond that we have, and is just a really big, important opportunity. Food is nutrition, but it's nourishing not only our bodies, but our social connections and our emotional well-being. So I really love talking about that. And it's an easy way to make a big difference for your families. So now are some strategies to talk about expansion of diet or getting interested in food. So one of the big things that is important to understand that it is continued exposure, or the idea that it can take several times for an exposure to a food for a child to become comfortable with it or even interested in engaging with it, let alone eating it. And that's a natural thing. Our brain is trying to protect us all the time. So it needs multiple opportunities to be exposed to something that might be unfamiliar or new or not as preferred, or is a flavor that might be giving a signal that it's not okay, like bitter. Bitter is telling our brain this might be poisonous. So that might be a flavor that takes a lot of exposure for the brain to feel really comfortable saying, okay, this is safe. We can go ahead and eat this. And for some kids, those exposures might happen really quickly. It might all be in one meal. It might be I see it, I smell it, I touch it, and then I taste it. Those were five, 3 or 4 or 5 interactions that happened all kind of at once. For some kids, it's going to be many discrete interactions over a long period of time, could even be years, where at first they're just comfortable looking at something, and then they may actually find that they're comfortable touching it, but not eating it. And over time, they may actually try it. We definitely see the need for those multiple food exposures with really strong flavors, especially those ones like bitter, tart, or foods that have really tough textures that are harder to like kind of figure out actually how to chew and to eat. And of course, preferences are always going to still exist. And so leaving some room for your child to just never like a certain food is important too. But to help encourage them that sometimes it may take a lot of exposure can be helpful to get them more comfortable with that variety. And it's important to understand that exposure does not always have to mean eating the food, or actually doesn't have to mean involving food at mealtime at all. And that brings me to food play and food interactions, because exposure to food and creating a positive relationship to food that helps to reduce that anxiety, or it can count as, a positive food exposure, doesn't mean it has to be at the table around mealtime or with any expectation to eat it at all. So these are some examples, but it can really run the gamut depending on what your child likes and what's going on with your family. But some examples might include doing science experiments, making observations around food, like let's see 3 different foods. What's inside? Do they all have seeds? What color is it on the outside? What color is it on the inside? Kind of making hypotheses and doing experiments and seeing what the outcomes are. Something as simple as going grocery shopping and pointing foods out to kids can be really helpful. Cooking together, getting, those food safe cutting utensils and things that they can get involved in. And even if your kid is in the kitchen with you while you're cooking and like engaging with a food, they may not be helping you actually like with the recipe that's at hand. They may just be kind of making a mess, but that's all in the fun of it. If they're curious and playful with it, they may even try the food while they're doing that. That's always really fun. You can get them to serve food to people at the table if you're serving it family style. Do things like spell your name or make a letter, stacking food with to make a little tower. There are little placemats you can get online that are kind of sciencey, and you put the food in different categories. Talking about meal planning. So there's just so many ways to engage with food and create a positive exposure around food that has nothing to do with eating, and can really lower the amount of anxiety or stress that might be kind of going off in the background in your child's mind if they're having a really hard time with food, or if they're super, super picky and they don't want that expectation that you think they think you're going to make them eat it. So keeping it fun, keeping it playful can be really powerful. Talking about food and how we talk about it can be how they talk about it to themselves and what their inner voice really sounds like. So we're just providing them with a vocabulary for everything in their lives. But with food, it's really important to help give them those words to have a healthy relationship to food, and engage with food in a positive way. I usually recommend not talking about foods as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy, and instead just sort of objectively describing how they're different. That helps to keep the stress around them um, low. And also, it it acknowledges that certain kids have access to some foods and others don't. And so, if you start talking about foods as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy, they may see another child eating a food that you've put into one of those categories, and it may bring up some contention. And also, there is no morality around food. Every food offers something. And I think it's important just to kind of help give them the vocabulary about what is it that it's offering. A food that's mostly just a simple carbohydrate, like a sugar food, we can say that's only one type of nutrient. That's just a carbohydrate, a quick energy carbohydrate. And we need a lot of other foods to be healthy and grow. We need a little bit of this type of food, and we need a lot of other types of food. Fruits and vegetables, we need a lot of these types of foods, and they have a lot of nutrients in them. So just sort of talking about foods in that way versus like these ones are bad and these ones are good can be really, really helpful, and also can reduce stress. Like if a child thinks they're eating a bad food, they may be thinking that they're doing a bad thing when it may not really be that black and white, right? So I do encourage you to think about ways that you can help weave these kinds of things into conversation. If a child says, I don't like it, you can simply say, I understand you don't have to eat that. You don't like it right now. Maybe you'll like it again and next time you try it, right? So kind of keeping the door open as well is another way to kind of like keep the talk positive and open and light. And you may not even need to talk about food at all, like I had said in the beginning, especially if there's a lot of tension, if there's a lot of anxiety around coming to the table at all. I find not talking about food really specifically it can be helpful. So, in terms of gradual diet expansion, consistent small changes can help offer variety. And it can be variety that really gets you to building variety in nutrition as well. Um, and the small tweaks are especially helpful for those kids who are super picky or super selective, because the small changes can be less anxiety provoking than big changes. And we don't want to raise the alarm system that might be happening for some kids by offering just tiny little changes. Change one thing about a food that is already well accepted and preferred. So, examples like for this might be, okay, we're always eating red apples. Would you like to try a green apple or a yellow apple? You like shredded cheese. Would you try a sliced cheese? You like orange cheese. Would you try yellow cheese? We usually cut this food into this shape, like cucumbers in slices. Would you try it in a spear? Something that's sort of similar but a little bit different, like waffle versus pancake. For some kids, it may just be as simple as different brands. Like we do chicken nuggets that look almost identical, but this is one brand and this is another. They might taste slightly different. They might be in a slightly different shape. Even different shapes of pasta, um, different types of bread, different types of nut butters if your child likes PB&J. So all of these things can really just help your child understand that food comes in variety, and that variety is positive for their health and well-being. And just getting their body comfortable with and their brain comfortable with the idea of variety and change, because kids really enjoy things to be the same. And you may notice that they gravitate towards foods that taste the same every single time, that are highly palatable. And we're just sort of gradually starting to teach them that change is actually okay, and that their brain doesn't have to be worried about that. And that can happen in really small ways. And if you're really consistent about it, it can make a really positive, powerful impact over time. This is something fun I like to talk about, novelty. And this isn't a strategy you'd be using every day or at every mealtime. And it can really be one of a million things that you can do. But what I like about novelty and adding something different or fun or silly at meal times is that sometimes getting to the table is really tough for some kids. And there are so many things in the world right now that give our brains a rush of dopamine or a happy hormone like screen time or scrolling or video games or things like that. And there's not a great way to give ourselves that rush of joyful feeling when it comes to the day-to-day tasks. And novelty can really add that and make it just feel really exciting and fun, by adding something like these examples, like wearing silly outfits or hats, serving food differently. Do you usually serve it individually? Can you serve it big, family style? Can you eat with crazy utensils or eat with serving spoons that are really big? That's so silly. Can you do a picnic outside or inside? Add color, add food coloring or sprinkles. Do a dinner party with all the stuffed animals. It can really be anything. And the idea is just to make it kind of like big and fun and exciting so that it gives that feeling that like this is a really special moment and meal times can be fun. And kids just really respond really well to fun, and funny and exciting things. So have fun with that. The last thing, I like to talk about is flavor. And because a lot of young kids tend towards bland foods, we can kind of shy away from flavor. But there are ways to add flavor that are kind of more in that like toddler friendly, family, and can actually make it really much more interesting to kids. For example, roasting or grilling can develop flavor in fruits and vegetables that might not otherwise be accepted. Adding flavor, adding fat like olive oil, really can make a food taste more palatable, more delicious. Adding spices and herbs, garlic, onion, citrus, wherever you can. Cheese can be your friend, in these situations as well. Letting kids kind of like figure out what flavors and what kind of cooking techniques they like, and seeing how, foods can be different. The same foods can be different depending on how they're flavored, can be a really fun way to add interest to meal times. Um, and so that brings us to the next sort of segment where we're talking about how do we fill the gaps when we're working on this sort of diet expansion slowly, right? I've said build the sandbox and let them play within it. That means that they're going to potentially take more time to get to that well balanced, varied diet that we're hoping for long term nutrition and growth. So it is important to fill the gaps and think about layering nutrition in a mindful way. The benefit is that we already know that this is sort of a phenomenon, picky eating can happen, and that there are actually big nutrition gaps for both kids and adults in the United States. And there are big public health initiatives that have helped to fill some of these gaps by fortification or enrichment of foods. So, for example, flour in the US is fortified with iron and B vitamins. Milk is fortified with vitamin D. A lot of foods are fortified with iron, particularly cereals. Many foods these days have added fiber or protein. So you'll see that, over and over again, that there are either, government public health initiatives that are mandated or just kind of trends that you see over time, in the market for things that help to fill those gaps. For some kids, supplementation can be helpful or even necessary, depending on where they're at with their diet. And sometimes just taking some extra steps to layer nutrition into certain recipes, especially when we start early, can be super helpful. I do want to caveat that I never want your kids to feel like they're being tricked into eating anything. Like I wouldn't be, encouraging you to hide foods in other foods, right? And mixing them in a way that masks a flavor, because we're hoping to help them understand that foods taste different and what they look like whole and things like that. But the layering of nutrition can be a helpful tool to help ensure nutritional adequacy while you work on that big acceptance of lots of different foods. And it's helpful for you. It's helpful. I do it myself for my own nutrition, as well as for my own sons, but it's something that, you can be careful about the verbiage or how you're talking about it, because if they've said they don't like it, I wouldn't encourage you to keep doing something that they didn't like so that they don't feel kind of tricked into things. I don't want you to compromise the trust and safety piece to layer in nutrition. Here are some examples of how I layer in nutrition. There are lots of ways to incorporate more fruits and veggies into diet. I love using yogurt, especially Greek yogurt, as a vehicle for lots of things. I add it to oatmeal. I add it to pasta sauces. I use it as a dip. You can mix it into plain cereal and milk for a little boost of protein and fat. Lots of dips and spreads can be helpful. And different flavorings and even adding herbs and spices can add a boost of antioxidants. So if you're doing that in like a dip setting, that's really helpful. A variety of nuts and seeds, whether that's like adding seeds to something like oatmeal or baked goods or nut butters or seed butters. And variety in that is really helpful because all nuts and seeds have a little bit of different nutrition. So that can be helpful too. Pasta sauce, kids tend to really kind of gravitate towards pasta, so you can use sauce as a vehicle for adding in some extra nutrition there. And meat and protein, some kids struggle with because of the tough texture of meats. So cooking things down, making them a little bit easier to chew and handle, or mix them into other foods, chop them finely, or try brands that are protein fortified. So when you might want to seek more help from individualized providers. If you're seeing a pattern of your child missing entire food groups almost every day, that would be something that I would be worried that there are some bigger nutrition gaps that we need to either supplement or work on as far as layering and nutrition. Definitely, if there are growth concerns or other sort of markers that you see like anemia, this one's a little harder. Frequent colds, it's harder to kind of identify because kids are going to get sick, especially in the winter in colder areas. But if it's taking them a really long time to recover, or if they're getting sick, especially outside of cold and flu season, that might be something to consider. Constipation or other GI concerns. And especially if your child is expressing any sort of strong fear or anxiety about food, I would encourage you to talk to your pediatrician and see if there's a way to get a referral to somebody who may have experience in talking to children about that. Always be in touch with your pediatrician first. They're going to be monitoring growth patterns with you. They can talk through symptoms you're concerned about, and they can make referrals to specific providers. And you can always meet with a dietitian for individualized counseling. If generally you've already talked to the pediatrician and you just need a little bit more coaching. Nutrition is often health insurance covered. My visits are health insurance covered currently. So access to nutrition support from a dietitian is a lot more accessible these days. Feeding therapy is also an option for kids who are really extreme on the picky selective eating, especially when it's behavioral or sensory. And usually a feeding therapist is going to be a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist. And there are lots of options for that these days as well. These are just a couple of links that I'll put in the comments as well. Some recipe websites that I like for young kids, and some educational websites, including that Division of Responsibility in Feeding website. I get a lot of information from healthychildren.org, which is from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So these are just some really helpful places to look when you have questions. And I thank you so much for being here. You can find out more about me and booking with me on my website, blossomingnutrition.com. And I hope to see you in another video again soon. Bye.